Thank you, Sandy, and thanks for the opportunity to come to another conference. I thought I'd actually retired a year or two ago, but Sandy brought me out. So I am sort of semi-retired. I've set up a private consultancy, but I've had sort of 25 years experience with the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry, the Australian government's agency, and I've played various roles in the berry industry. I've reacquainted myself with Ridley earlier, which is lovely to see. But I was the manager of the Victorian Berry Pathogen Testing Program, was the National Plant Pathology Coordinator for quarantine for a number of years. And in the last 6 or 7 years, I set up a Plant Innovation Centre just for my sins. And during that journey, there's been a lot of changes have been made to the quarantine input conditions for berry crops. Now, I am going to just use strawberries as a case study. However, many of these changes do go across all the berry crops, which is something that's really impressed. So just quickly, why is biosecurity important? Increase in trade and people movement is creating a global biosecurity highway. We last couple of years in Australia, we have 8 million passengers that come in, 158 million mail parcels, 41 million containers, and about 5 million plants every year that come into Australia. Most of those are what's considered to be low or medium risk plants. At the border, these are a little bit old, these figures, but they're still relevant. The seizures of biosecurity risk management material is slowly on the increase, and the number of border incursions are also increasing. So the take-home message there is that biosecurity pest and disease risks are real and they are increasing. These are some of the general threats to the Australian berry industry. There's a whole range of exotic viruses of berry crops. For the strawberry industry, angular leaf spot is exotic. We don't particularly want it. Most importantly, our number one Australia's plant biosecurity pest is Xylella, and that in fact impacts or infects more than 600 odd crops, including blueberries, causing blueberry scorch. We haven't got it in the country, and again, we definitely do not want that one. That one's a really bad one. And we've also got another one that we haven't got is red steel, Phytophthora frugare, variety frugare, and that causes reddening of strawberry crowns. So the take-home message, particularly to any importers, I'm sure no one in this audience would consider such a thing, but please do not take shortcuts with biosecurity. It's you and your industry then ultimately suffer. So just a quick journey on the quarantine program. So when I first started in 1995, Australia was allowing imported strawberry runner plants or blueberry cut-ins or raspberry cut-ins, etc. Now the problem with that is that strawberry runners coming straight from the ground present a high disease risk. The post-entry quarantine, PEQ, post-entry quarantine period was a minimum of 2 years. So to bring a new variety in from overseas took a minimum of 2 years. Obviously that delays and is costly for industry to access new genetics. And we've heard all morning how important new genetics is to all the industries. The other big challenge when I started was the virus testing program was purely based on biological indexing or biological indicators, using sap inoculation onto a range of herbaceous indicators and PDL grafting onto University of California indicator plants. Now that presented a whole bunch of challenges. They're really difficult to interpret results when you're trying to interpret bioassays. Took up a lot of glasshouse space, and there's a decline in expertise in the world on this sort of procedure. So some of the early changes I made is I got industry and regulators into a room together, and I was able to convince them that we need to stop this nonsense about importing plant material, and we should only allow tissue culture imports. Now that took some time, particularly for the regulators, but the industry were on board pretty quickly. They understood the importance of it. And since that change, the disease risk has gone whoosh. We very rarely pick things up anymore, purely because of that simple change. I also introduced a whole range of active testing for bacteria and viruses, and used the transmission electron microscope for a generic virus approach. And they all improved the detection of exotic pathogens. Then the next decade, I introduced, and when I say I, it's a collective we, introduced a whole lot of new, at the time, ELISA and PCR tests, which is quite comical now when you look at everyone in the community knows about PCR tests from COVID. But they were new then, and we introduced a whole range of different tests. And again, that improved the diagnostics and further reduced the disease risk. And Sandy, yes, I did have dark hair at one stage of my life. I also compiled the first strawberry post-entry quarantine testing manual. Again, quite comical at the time, but when I first started in 95, 96, I rang Canberra and said, right, I'm here. Can you tell me what I'm supposed to test for? And they laughed at me. They said, no, we don't know what you're supposed to test for. And I said, well, can you tell me what techniques I'm supposed to use? And they laughed louder. And so one of my missions was to start putting together a post-entry quarantine testing manual, which took a long time. But again, that improved the transparency of the testing program. Most importantly, I was able to reduce the post-entry quarantine period from 24 months to 18 months in a 25% discount. And again, that meant faster and safer access to new genetics. I also started visiting and auditing some of our overseas suppliers of high health plants, including Driscoll's and FPS in California. And so that ensured that those overseas sources conform to Australia's quarantine regulations. Then in 2015, the Knoxfield and the Eastern Creek plant post-entry quarantine facilities both closed down. And we were building a brand new national post-entry quarantine facility, which opened up in 2015 November. I had a bit of play in helping design the diagnostic laboratories, and then eventually I developed the inaugural pest and post-entry quarantine testing manual, which didn't previously exist. So that took me about 10 years. So I do understand why quarantine laughed at me when I first started, but that was a nice little legacy, I think. And then in 2015, because Knoxfield closed and I lived about 10 minutes up the mountain, and Mickleham was about an hour and 20 minutes that way, I said, see you later, guys. I'm not going to stay around. But people in Canberra said, well, what about you work from home? So I was a precursor to COVID working from home type concepts. And so I was able to convince them at a conference like this, over a glass of wine, to the executive officer of the department, all these ideas. So she came on board and basically gave me funding and, more importantly, the support to establish the inaugural Plant Innovation Centre for the department. And we had 3 objectives, and it's still continuing to this day: developing closer collaborative links with scientific agencies, engaging the tertiary education sector to attract future workforces, and partnering with industry to improve collaborative partnerships. And I'm really pleased to see Dr. Scott Matner in the audience, and Dr. Matner has been involved in a number of our projects together, which is great. In 2013, I was able to present at a plant biosecurity conference a wish list, a blue sky dream, and what I'd like. And what I posed at the audience was one test for all viruses. And 95% of the audience thought, oh, here we go again, Mark's on another blue sky dreaming journey. But there was a couple of people in the audience, and again, over a glass of 2 of wine, it's a common denominator. We came up with this concept, and I got some funding from Halt Innovation and PBCRC and the department, and we were able to look at this issue. Now, the reason we did it is because each year we have about 800 high-risk plants, and high-risk plants are things like berry crops, grapevines, stone fruit, potatoes, etc. And we run hundreds of different tests on all those using visual, herbaceous indexing, woody indexing, pedal grafting, ELISA, EM, PCRs and targeted PCRs. Now, they are really costly and time consuming to develop. Huge amount of space is required, labour intensive, and again, there's a decline in skill set in the workforce. So the Plant Innovation Centre to the rescue, and with our project partners, we started investigating high throughput sequencing, and it's got the potential to detect all plant viruses in a single test. So we got industry and the science partners and end users engaged. We got DAF, my department at the time, PBCRC and Hort Innovation. We spent about $4 million over 10 years. We had the experts from the QUT, and we had operational end users, the scientists in quarantine. We had policy regulators, which is always a big challenge, and IT experts. But also we had the importers engaged throughout the journey. Whoops. So the journey started in 2013. First few years, we just demonstrated proof of concept. And I do say, a bit like Jodie's presentation, these things take a long time. R&D, it's one part of it, but implementation's the other part of it. We optimized the lab protocols. We conducted 400 side-by-side trials comparing HTS, high throughput sequencing, with existing post-entry quarantine diagnostic assays, and we published peer-reviewed papers. And we needed to do all that to get the scientific evidence. And then working with the regulatory authorities and IT, in just before I left the department, in January 2023, we implemented HTS for frugary, for strawberries, for rubus and prunus imports. First quarantine agency in the world to do that, and quite a nice little thing to leave behind. So what impact did it have for strawberry plants? So 13 separate virus tests were replaced with one test, verified it to be more efficient and effective. It's reduced the post-entry quarantine test. Rather than having to run 13 different tests, we only run one now. Most importantly though, it's also reduced the time in post-entry quarantine to 12 months. So it started 24 months, now we're down to 12 months. And it's faster and safer access to new genetics. So as the berry industry heard this morning, you can't just rest on your laurels, you have to keep looking in the future. So some future ideas is to investigate high throughput sequencing of tissue culture plants on arrival. So rather than waiting 6 or 12 months to grow them up, can we test them on day one to see if there's any pathogens of concern? And there is a Plant Innovation Centre project that's just commenced to investigate that. Can we develop one single test to identify all bacteria in a single test? Again, it's a little bit out there, but I believe the answer is yes. And there is an AgVic project underway at the moment. Can the regulators investigate offshore high throughput sequencing testing and imports of in vitro plants? So rather than having one tissue culture plant come in, we keep it in quarantine for 12 months and do all the testing and then release one plant at the end of it. Can we import 100 plants and that have all come from the original mother plant, and we test that one original mother plant, and in the meantime we can propagate those 100 in tissue culture, and so the importers then get 1,000 or 10,000, however many they need. And then just before I left, I was talking about this concept of a global safe plant passport. So is it possible to remove post-entry quarantine altogether? Might put your breeding program in competition a little bit there, Jodie, but that's the future. So yeah, can we innovate post-entry quarantine testing to enable faster and safer access to new genetics, thereby improving productivity and international competitiveness of our industry? And here's a few lessons that I've learned along the way. It is critical that researchers, industry and government policy regulators all need to engage and work collaboratively to ensure R&D outputs don't just collect dust. And unfortunately, I've seen too much of that money from Hort Innovation and other agencies go into some great programs, some great R&D's done, and it sits on somebody's library. It's great seeing Scott Matner and Dylan McFarlane be nominees for the Researcher of the Year, because that's the model. The work in industry working alongside researchers. R&D project ideas are easy. I can come up with a million ideas. Implementation is absolutely harder, and it takes much, much longer. And it's also a different skill set and needs more funding too. Quarantine policy changes must be science-based with support and evidence. That's a given. And for any researcher out there, I'd say dream big and be courageous. Be passionate about what you're doing. Persist, because you will come up with a lot of hurdles. And believe, but if you believe in what you're doing is right, you'll be successful. But most importantly, have fun along the way. And just my last slide, or second last slide here, is some acknowledgements. I wanted to acknowledge the Talangi Strawberry Certification Runner Cooperative and the Victorian Strawberry Industry Certification Authority in Talangi, particularly George Weeder. I've known George for in excess of 30 years and for his support and friendship. I'd like to thank Sandy and Jen Rowland for inviting me here. I have to definitely acknowledge all the teams that I've worked with and had the pleasure of leading during the journey, and some specific individuals there that I have good friendships with. And the last slide is thank you for the opportunity to work with your industry for the last 25, 30 odd years. I hope some of these changes have made a positive impact, and I love leaving quotes. So my poor two kids, they constantly get quotes. But agricultural success relies on government, scientists and industry all working together. And the value of an idea lies in using it. So on that note, thank you very much, and open to any questions. Sandy. The big one was funding. So through Hort Innovations and PPCRC, that was a big contributing factor. And just having them on board, because ultimately if they resist some of these changes, particularly something like high throughput sequencing, that was an idea that was way out there. And so if I had resistance on that concept, it wouldn't have been adopted, because then they would have written to my regulator colleagues and said, we don't agree with this. And so throughout that journey, I gave a number of presentations on what was happening in that space. And even now, last November, I was involved in a discussion with industry groups on HTS. So. I might move close because I'm right here. I'm getting old. So the basic question was that a Japanese breeder is inquiring how do they get new varieties into Australia. So essentially, you will need to partner up with an Australian importer. So you can't export it without an importer being in Australia. That won't be a government person. It will have to be an industry person. Maybe have a chat with Joe. I don't know when you sit in that space. But maybe have a chat with her. Yeah.
Ivan Whattam from Biosecurity. Just wondering how far away from propagation during quarantine in Australia is.
What would they mean by how far away?
How many years away from that being a possibility?
So everyone here, the question is basically how estimated, how long will it take before Australia will be able to allow imported plants without going through quarantine.
Or being in quarantine, but being able to propagate while it's being tested and going through the quarantine process.
Right. It can actually happen now. So you can import strawberries and potatoes in tissue culture and other crops. And we've got an arrangement with the State Department and in Victoria. And so while we're doing the testing, and I say we, once the department's doing the testing, the plants so they're exactly the same genetic material, but they're being propagated up in tissue culture as we do the 12 months testing. So we used to offer that at Knoxfield, but it became too big because everyone wanted to do it. And so we actually had to outsource that. But the longer term future about can we get a global plant passport, I think we're still probably another 5 or 10 years away from that, to be realistic. But I think we're on that journey. With HTS, we're on the journey. So good question. Yeah. What? Yeah, absolutely. So I think that correct me if I'm wrong. I think the question is Holland's already had a flat passport for a long time. So I'd just like to extend that concept to make the global one, particularly for Australia. Australia and New Zealand quarantine. It's not like Europe. You can't swap it. It doesn't want the quarantine test. So that concept is what I'd like to extend. When it happens, the use of the cloud. So basically, when the question was the quarantine facilities, everything has to come to the national post-secondary quarantine Victoria. So Western Australia used to have the quarantine facility, but they're very, very costly to run. And the states made a decision around sort of 2015 when the national facility opened up, a lot of state ones started to apply this. I think there is still some work in that south, but not very. So, thank you very much.